you see that the non-OPEC supply is flat. OPEC production is almost flat. You add them up, that's world production. So world production was flat, demand was going up, and you can see what happened to prices. Just to look at non-OPEC production here, just to look at the component, the blue is the US and Canada, the former Soviet Union, the green, and other non-OPEC is the red. Flat, flat, this is flat here, but even if you go in the previous years, this is just a recovery. This is not even an increase, because without the collapse of the Soviet Union, this would have been just a straight line. So production was flat, demand was increasing, and the only way we can meet demand is to utilize OPEC spare capacity. That's what we see in those red bars. OPEC spare capacity just vanished, and oil prices skyrocketed. It is as simple as that. But this is not the end of the story. At the end of that packet, there are a couple of articles that show you the numbers. While production was flat and demand was going up, OPEC exports went down. And you heard about it from Professor Gately this morning. OPEC exports went down. In fact, every time you can see that correlation, every time speculators enter the market, you can see that correlation with the decline in OPEC exports. So it's very hard even to make that distinction in the data, whether the effect is coming from exports or from speculators. So it is that simple. Now, here is the question, and I'm asking this question in a way to avoid talking about demand just to save time. Can supply keep up with demand? And the answer is no. And therefore, I don't have to talk about demand. I just have to talk about the shortage in this case. It cannot, because we have 4 vicious cycles that are supporting high prices. And when I say high prices, I'm talking about $70 to $90 range, because we are talking about fundamentals. We're not talking about other geopolitical events and natural events. We have 4 vicious cycles. The first cycle, oil prices go up. All revenues of the oil producers go up. Their government spending go up. Their economic growth goes up, but that will coalesce with a population boom. So they end up with a population boom and economic boom. As a result, energy consumption goes up. And when we talk about energy, we are talking only about 3 resources: oil, gas, and electricity. And they use more oil, they use more gas, their exports go down, prices worldwide go up again. And then the cycle goes on and on and on. So the $70 to $90 oil basically is supported by several vicious cycles, and this is one of them. It is the consumption in those countries. Now, some of you may say, well, it's small anyway. Well, remember, if we have one buyer in the market who requests 1,000 barrels and cannot find them, that will increase prices. As long as there are buyers who are scrambling for oil and they cannot find it, then prices will go up. So energy consumption in those countries was going up. And we end up with a vicious cycle. The second one is, those countries suffered when oil prices were $10. They suffered when oil prices were $140. And we can debate that, whether they suffered or not, but I think they did, because they ended up with massive inflation. But they've seen prices at 10 and they've seen it at 140, so it was only logical to diversify their economy. That means they are going to take oil revenues and spend those oil revenues on everything else but capacity to meet growing demand worldwide. And that by itself is going to reduce the availability of supply, or make the supply unable to meet growing demand. In the future, prices go up, and then they see, every time prices go up, they become more dependent on oil, because the portion of revenues that are coming from oil is getting larger and larger. So now they want to diversify even more. And we end up with another vicious cycle. But this is not the end of the story. We end up with major increase in energy consumption, which means that we end up with a major increase in power consumption. And as a result, we are ending up with power shortages throughout OPEC members and non-OPEC members. Almost every oil-producing country in the world beside Norway is suffering from power shortages. What is the impact of power shortages on oil prices? Well, we have enough evidence, because I've done the field study, and I'm the one who broke out the story on the impact of power shortages in 2003. The first thing is, when it comes July and August, those countries start burning crude oil in their power plants to avoid a shortage. We have enough evidence to show it was crude oil that was intended to export. So this is a double-edged sword, because it's not only increasing demand, it's cutting exports too. That's the first one. What is the second one? Well, the second one is, when you end up with power shortages, if you look at a case like Ajman or Sharjah, these are big cities around Dubai, there are hundreds of residential towers that are empty. And they are empty because there is no power. The investors who invested in those buildings, they thought they can borrow from the bank, build the building, they end up with tenants, they collect the money at the end of the month, pay the bank, and they keep doing this until they pay off the building. But if there is no power, there are no tenants, and therefore you go bankrupt. So some of them basically just decided to walk out and left the building to the bank, and others basically were smart enough to realize, why I don't end up with a private generation, and I'll bring the plant, the generators from overseas. Those generators basically are big enough, probably about the size of this room each, but you cannot run the generator 24 hours a day. You need a backup. So you put them in the backyard of that building and you use diesel. And if you drive around, it's a very messy situation, because they have to have several tanks of diesel with those big trucks coming in to put diesel in them, and then those agent workers basically are trying to take the diesel from in very primitive way, taking the diesel from the tanks to the generators. So around all those buildings, basically, there are fuel oil or diesel all over the ground. So it's a very messy operations. But these are in thousands. I'm not talking about one or two events here. These are in thousands. So diesel consumption went up because of this. And in the last 2 years, we've seen something very strange happened. Just imagine yourself in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, or in around in Ajman or Sharjah, and it is in the afternoon, and the temperature is 140. And the power goes out. Now, if you have brownout, all you get to do, just put your family in a car and go to the mall where they have power and enjoy the cool atmosphere. But when you have blackout, there is no mall to go to. So what do? You drive your car around hours and hours and hours until the power comes back, and gasoline consumption went up. So diesel consumption went up, gasoline consumption went up, and crude oil consumption went up just because of power shortages. And we've seen this in China before. And this is going to continue, and there is no solution, based on our estimate, there is no solution until at least 2021. So this is going to be with us for a while. What is the role of nationalism here? We did not talk about it today, but I'm going to bring it up. Nationalism basically is good and bad. And what do we mean by nationalism? If you look at the left side here, in the 70s, 93% of the production and most of the oil reserves in the world were controlled by international oil companies. Now, 77% of the production and most of the oil reserves are controlled by national oil companies that are owned by their own governments. Nationalism is good and bad. What's good about nationalism? Nationalism is good because if you look at the evidence in the last 50 years, it ensures the flow of oil. You look at countries where oil is nationalized, you don't see interruptions. You look at Libya, for example, 1.6 throughout, 3 decades. Nothing. You look at the countries that did not nationalize, there are always some groups that are mad at the government, mad at the foreign companies, and the first thing they do is bomb the pipelines. We've seen it in Colombia, we've seen it in Southern Sudan, we've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in other countries. So the good side of nationalism is that it leads to stability and it leads to continuous flow of oil. But the bad side is it does not grow with demand. So that's the bad side of it. And since most of it is controlled, most of the cheap reserves are controlled by the national oil companies, this control basically forced. Now, the national oil companies are not increasing supply all the time in a discrete way to meet the growth in demand that is discrete or continuous. As a result, that job is left to the international oil companies to meet whatever gaps left. And since they have no control of the cheap reserves, nationalism pushes the international oil companies to invest in high-cost areas. And it just happened that high-cost areas come with small reserves and high decline rates. And to keep the momentum going and to meet the growth in demand, you need more money every year, more than before, to invest in those areas because of the small reserves and high decline rates. But investors are not going to put the money unless prices are high. So beside those 4 cycles that I mentioned supporting prices, nationalism itself is helping that too. And if you look at the evidence here, what we've done on this chart is we ranked world oil reserves, and then we plotted the economic freedom index against them. But since the numbers are small and you cannot see them from far away, we decided to color code them. Red is not accessible. Green is accessible. And you can see that most of the world reserves are not accessible. We put green for Canada as accessible, but some of my colleagues at the firm basically questioned that too. We have very large investment in Canada, by the way, and we just signed a $1 billion deal there. If you go through the regulations, they are as nationalistic as any OPEC member. So there are questions about that green too. And I'm not going to talk about Alaska, promise. So if you look at this, basically, that shows the impact of nationalism. And there is another issue that is supporting high prices. What is the role of the budgetary requirements of the oil producers, that OPEC and non-OPEC in this case? Now, to go back to the OPEC literature, there is a model in OPEC literature known as the target revenue model. And the target revenue model basically talks about the idea that probably OPEC is not a cartel, but they adjust their production based on their budget needs. And therefore, we see production cuts because of that. Well, there is a paper in that packet on this, and I already debunked this. I found out basically only 2 members are subject to this model, and that are the most isolated OPEC members, Libya and Iran. But it turns out there's something very interesting out of this chart that I'm going to show you here. What we've done here is we created, and someone asked this question earlier, we created 3 prices. We estimated the budget price for every OPEC member, and that's 2010, 2011. And the budget price basically is the blue. And then we estimated what we call the pain price and the social cost price. Now, the blue, the budget price basically is based on the available numbers from the budget, and then we made our own estimates on that. It is very clear that those countries are requiring high prices. Before, they were happy with 2025. They were happy with 18. Remember when the Clinton administration had an agreement with OPEC about $25, and President Clinton said 25 is fine, and OPEC said 25 is fine? This is no longer the case. If you look at the budget prices, basically, most of them are between $50 and $70. They are no longer 25. If you look at the pain price, what is the pain price? We said, okay, at what price, if prices decline, at what price OPEC members will suffer from social instability, political instability, or they will be forced to cooperate with Saudi Arabia and cut production? Historically, this price was around $10. Look at it now. It's in the 40s. So even the requirements in this case quadrupled. And that means they need a higher price. You look at the social cost. On the social cost, basically, we assume the following. If we allow each OPEC member to price its own oil, will they take $5,000 for it, $10,000? What is it? No, they are not going to do that, because people will go to the competition, and who cares about their price? But we come up with the following assumption. We said, okay, let's assume that they will charge the price that will guarantee enough economic growth in their country that eliminates unemployment. Because that's going to lead, supposedly going to lead to stability. And that's how we created those numbers, and they are in the 70s and 80s. Now, those countries at the bottom with low numbers, with low bars here, Remember, Qatar, UAE has LNG, so they have other source of income. Qatar LNG, Libya has LNG, and Algeria has LNG. So their numbers are small simply because they have other source of income. Can OPEC deliver?